Introduce myself. I'm Rob Robinson, a member of the board of directors of Left Forum. This is a fundraiser titled Roots of the Crisis. It's the start of a series that we hope to produce of online events throughout the summer. But before I go forward, let me just put in a little bit of a disclaimer. We are in a tough time, and as people in progressive movements, we're sometimes challenged by corporations and the ability to get our message across. We are using a platform right now that a lot of folks don't necessarily agree with, including some of today's speakers. Unfortunately, we had to make a choice so that we could make sure to get out to as many people as possible, but we will look for alternatives in the future. But I just want to make it clear that it's not necessarily a piece of software that we're married to or building any type of relationship with, right? Sometimes our backs are forced against the wall and we have to make choices that don't necessarily agree with us or the work that we're currently doing. Again, thank you all for joining Roots of the Crisis. My name is Rob Robinson. We have an incredible group of panelists to speak to you today about issues that are going on right now, past and present, and probably in the future, unless we rise up and maybe create another party. But that's just a voice of Rob Robinson speaking there. You'll hear from the panelists. They may agree, they may not agree, but I'm certainly sure we have some expert panelists again. This is a fundraiser, and I want to make it clear, Left Forum generally does in-person events. Because of the COVID-19 crisis, we were forced to cancel our conference in 2020 and 2021. We hope to do an in-person conference in the spring, late spring of 2022. But we will produce a bunch of online events, starting with the Roots of the Crisis and continuing through the fall and spring. We will introduce some classes. We started this process last fall with a couple of online courses, and we hope to expand that curriculum coming up this fall. I would ask you to just look at the Left Forum website. You can visit us at www.leftforum.org. And we would ask you if you could support Left Forum by making a donation. Every little bit helps. Our work is generally supported by that online in-person conference. We weren't able to do the last 2 years, so we're struggling a little bit to get resources to move to spring of 2022. I want to take this opportunity to thank Matt Benetti, who is our only staff person at Left Forum, who did a lot of work behind the scenes to make this event happen, along with Monza Sivashankar, who is an intern with Left Forum and a volunteer support person. Thank you both for all the work you did to make this event possible. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to two of my fellow board members, Karina Mullen and Uju Agarwal. Thank you and enjoy the seminar today.
So hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Rob, for getting us started, and welcome everyone. Thank you so much for taking time out of your Saturday to join us, and a special thank you to our amazing panelists for joining us today for kicking off this series of events for the Left Forum, such an important institution for so many of us over many, many years. As Rob mentioned, my name is Uju Agarwal. I'm going to be co-moderating today with Karina Mullen, and we just wanted to extend our thanks to folks from the Left Forum, Rob Robinson, Matt Benetti, Rachel Scott, Manny Ness, Michael Pelias, Rick Wolf, and Mansa for making this event possible and all the work they put forward for the Left Forum in general. So this conversation today is entitled Roots of the Crisis, and our amazing lineup includes Rabab Abdulhadi, Mireille Fanon Mendès-France, Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz, and Toussaint Losier, who will launch today for us a series of events organized by the Left Forum under the theme Planetary Crises, Building Struggle over the Coming Months.
Thanks, Uju, and thank you, Rob. I just want to also say thank you to the panelists and to everyone for joining us today. So this past year has seen a catastrophic combination of interrelated crises, highlighting how vulnerabilities of health and climate are produced by racial capitalism, settler colonialism, and imperialism, and are structured and work through race, class, gender, geography, and disability. Far from accidental, these outcomes are the direct result of centuries of plunder and accumulation through dispossession, and most recently, decades of defunding and privatization of public institutions and a dismantling of the global North welfare state on the one hand and the global South developmentalist state on the other. The last year has also made clear that our survival is interlinked. So for this session, the first is, as Uju and Rob explained, of our series. Our amazing speakers will focus on the systemic causes of these crises, from racial capitalism, imperialism, extractivist and constant growth models of development, labor exploitation, capitalist-induced climate devastation, and settler colonialism.
And the second component that are kind of our focus today is that while we want to think about the roots of the crises, we also at the same time across the globe and at various scales have seen liberation movements grow from here in Turtle Island to Palestine, from Haiti to Colombia, as well as intensified organizing in the form of worker mobilization, strikes, radical mutual aid, and occupations, demanding everything from the abolition of racist institutions and organized violence to access to personal protective equipment, safe worker environments, and rent and eviction moratoriums. From debt cancellation and end to neoliberal economic policies, structural adjustment and imperialist sanctions, to a redistribution of wealth and food sovereignty, the roots of the crisis and the organizing amidst it show us how our struggles are interconnected. If ever this is a time to come together, learn, share, fortify our movements in solidarity.
Great, so I will just explain now a little bit about the format of today's panel. We are going to begin by introducing our first speaker, and we'll then we'll introduce each speaker and give a proper bio for each speaker right before they speak. So one at a time. We will then move into a short moderated discussion where Uju and I will try to pose some questions that will draw out parallels and similarities, intersections between the presentations, as well as offer an opportunity for panelists to ask questions to each other. And then we will move on to the question and answer period with the participants. So our first speaker today, we're very lucky to have with us Dr. Toussaint Losier, who is an assistant professor in the W.E.B. Du Bois Department of Afro-American Studies at the University of Massachusetts-Amherst. He has been a visiting scholar at Harvard University's Charles Warren Center for Studies in American History and is Woodrow Wilson National Foundation Career Enhancement Fellow. He is a co-author of Rethinking the American Prison Movement with Dan Berger, and is preparing a book manuscript tentatively titled War for the City, Black Liberation and the Consolidation of the Carceral State. Thanks so much for joining us, Toussaint. The floor is yours.
Well, one, I want to thank you for that wonderful introduction, and also thank all the folks who helped make what for me is this afternoon, although it might be different for other folks, this afternoon's event. And I wanted to take the opportunity to talk about some of the ways in which are kind of the various different crises we're living through are reflective of some of the particular dynamics of what scholars in particular have come to call the carceral state. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit. But I just want to kind of give some highlights in terms of just points that I want to touch on in the brief time that I have. I've been teaching a bit on Zoom and really just having various different conversations and meetings with people on Zoom. So I find it useful to at least foreground some of what I'm going to say. And one, and this probably doesn't need too much of a reminder, but just the links between the different forms of domination that folks experience, as well as forms of exploitation and what have you, that oftentimes we get very siloed in terms of how we approach these questions, but really the need to have an expansive and a broad perspective that's also attuned to the different particularities. Two, one of the key themes of our forum discussion is questions of racial capitalism, and in a lot of ways that oftentimes gets narrowly focused on forms of profit making and sort of exploitation or super exploitation. And I just want to introduce just the importance of just forms of domination and social control in terms of how we think about and talk about racial capitalism. And then more broadly, the links between the outside and the inside, especially when it comes to the carceral state. And one of the things that I think really typifies it is a series of demonstrations that are going to be coming up this summer and fall between August 21st and September 9th, called the Shut 'em Down demonstrations, which are being organized by prisoners across the country, as well as those who are in immigrant detention as well, and really calling for support and solidarity during this period of time at ICE detention centers, jails, prisons, as well as institutions of higher learning that oftentimes are profiting off of prison labor in one form or another. And want to just put out a call for folks to have this on their minds as we go into the summer, thinking about opportunities to be in solidarity with folks. And I think this question of solidarity is particularly important because one of the things that we have, I think, often overlooked in some of our conversations about our current crisis and the wave of protest and rebellion and really uprising that we saw on the streets last summer is the way in which that was mirrored in many ways and in some sense anticipated by demonstrations that took place behind bars. And I think in the few ways that we might have been reminded about this, there was a particularly poignant moment a little earlier this year on February 6th when demonstrators in demonstration took place, inside the sort of aptly named St. Louis Justice Center, which is the second of that city's large jails, where inmates who were held there took control of one of the guards at around 3 in the morning, were able to open a number of cells, gain control of a common area, and break down the windows on the 4th floor of the Justice Center, and held control of that area for about 7 hours. And in that time, protested the conditions that they found themselves in inside this jail. Clad in orange jumpsuits and white T-shirts, they really tried to convey a message about the experience of folks who were being held behind bars, even if they haven't been convicted of a crime, if they're just in jail at this particular moment in time. And this is done by, pretty kind of bluntly chanting no more long court dates, which was just a kind of indication of the fact that many people who are held in jail at this moment haven't been able to see a judge, certainly not in person, but even over Zoom, and have had the time of their detention extended. They chanted part of the chorus from a little Boosie song where he talks about not only feeling like he's been betrayed, but also that he's being treated like a slave. They held up signs talking about what happened to Anthony Smith, who was a Black man shot and killed by a St. Louis police officer back in 2011, but whose case and the failure to indict one of the officer involved touched out off its own round of protests in 2017. And they also held up signs, and these are, written onto the sort of plastic covers of individual property cases that detainees are allowed to have, calling for the freedom of prisoners who had been involved in the last round of protests. And this was actually the third protest that took place at this one jail. The first was in late December. There was another in January. And each time that individuals had been involved in nonviolently protesting about the lack of proper PPE being provided, about the poor quality of either the food or any of the other aspects of the conditions in the facility. They were tear gassed and transferred to even worse conditions in the medium security institution or workhouse in St. Louis. Part of what they were also calling for was freedom and kind of the end to the sort of brutal treatment of those who were involved in previous nonviolent protests. And I think it's worth highlighting this particular instance because it's one that some of us might be familiar with. There were images kind of pretty dramatically demonstrating kind of what was going on. It was subsequent to that February 6th demonstration. There were a couple others that took place later on. But I think it speaks to a number of different things that those who were involved in this demonstration did better than what some of us outside of jail and prison oftentimes don't do as good a job of, right? One of those is making this connection between the policing and prisons, right? So sometimes we have a habit of talking about, we're talking about questions of abolition, we'll talk about questions of police abolition, or we'll talk about questions of prison abolition, but we oftentimes don't do a very good job of sort of thinking across or even organizing across those different elements of, again, what some of us are calling the carceral state. If there are folks who are involved in questions of immigration detention, that form of state control often doesn't get connected to prisons and policing, right? And so one of the things that I think is pretty remarkable about some of the organizing that particular demonstration, that particular uprising really is demonstrative of, is the way in which some of the organizing by those who are incarcerated or imprisoned in one way or another has really spoken to this need to think more critically across these different forms of state control. And I think one of the best examples of that is this upcoming shutting down demonstration that's being organized this summer. It was called for by Jailhouse Lawyers Speak, which is a network of incarcerated human rights activists who have been involved in calling for previous national prison strikes. And those prison strikes are identified as really not just a question of those who are held in state prison or federal prison, but really, again, thinking across these different forms of social state control in terms of jails, immigrant detention centers, prisons, and what have you. And the call for this upcoming demonstration is really an effort to build on this really historic round of prisoner protest resistance that took place during 2020, and particularly I think is notable during April and May of 2020. And I just want to highlight those dates because I think it's notable that although the first hunger strikes around COVID conditions in prisons started on March 17th, and the protests that took place really extended through the summer and kind of had their resurgence, as the kind of February 6th demo might suggest, at the end of last year and the beginning of this year. They were happening at such a pace in in April and May that there were about, and this was across the United States, about 8 or 9 hunger strikes, hostage takings, protests, work stoppages a day. And on average, there were about one of these forms of prisoner action taking place during really a 9-month stretch, one of these happening every other day. And part of the reason I want to highlight that is if you just remember about kind of where we were last year at around this time, it was really in the midst of what seemed like, and what in many respects was, an unprecedented wave of protest. And one of the things I think is notable is that while that protest was obviously touched off by the murder of George Floyd, it really pulled on a variety of other issues as well too. And it did so in a way that kind of followed in the wake of some of what we saw take place behind bars. And there was no real clear articulation of some of the connections between some of the demonstrations that took place in places like Cook County Jail, the long-term treatment facility in California, and really jails and prisons across the country, and immigrant detention facilities as well. But one of the things that I think is notable is some of the street demonstrations that really started to take place during the course of the pandemic for those that were in solidarity with the conditions with folks who were behind bars. And that if you think more broadly about the fact that not only does the United States have the largest prisoner population in the world, with some 2.2, 2.3 million people incarcerated, but that's really breaks down to about one out of every 2 people in this country has a loved one, a family member who's behind bars. And that's very much concentrated in the communities that were represented on the streets last summer. And if we think about the kinds of conversations that folks might have with their loved ones in terms of the circumstances that they're facing and how they might think about what it means to be facing a pandemic with as little social support as we saw in our kind of aspect of society, and what that also means for their loved ones, that it's important for us to really try to, at least in terms of how we approach these crises that we're facing, think about some of the ways in which these problems very clearly kind of bleed across some of the boundaries of prison walls and bars and what have you. And then lastly, just to wrap up, I think it's important for us to take stock of what we've experienced over the past year, and just keep in mind that in addition to the pandemic, the economic, the political, and all the other crises that we're facing, on top of that, the environmental crisis, that as harrowing as they are, that they might in some ways anticipate or give us a small slice of what we could be facing in terms of the broader ways in which these crises could continue to compound in our society. And the degree to which we need to do our best to not only stand in solidarity and support each other, but find ways to organize and build, because we need to, do our best to not find ourselves in exactly the same sort of circumstances that we found ourselves last summer, and the ways that we found ourselves, where we find ourselves now, and really be in the position to not just be in the position of resisting, but finding ways to press the advantage and move forward in what could be even more difficult situations going forward. So probably not the most uplifting way to leave things, but just really some charge in terms of thinking about how we can learn from this particular moment and use that knowledge as a way to help kind of steel ourselves for the future and figure out how best to meet it in as bold a way as possible. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Toussaint. So much to think about in terms of, again, what we learn about organizing in this moment and the borders and boundaries that organizing already kind of transcends and needs to, as well as what we learn about from the crisis in anticipating how we move forward and think about any possible futures. Next, we're going to learn and hear from Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz, who grew up in rural Oklahoma in a tenant farming family. She is a historian, a writer, a professor emeritus at California State University, East Bay. A veteran of the 60s revolution, she was involved in organizing against the US war in Vietnam, US imperialism, racism, South African apartheid, and for workers' rights, and is one of the founders of the Radical Women's Liberation Movement in 1968. Since 1973, she has worked with Indigenous communities for sovereignty and land rights, and helped build the international Indigenous participation in the United Nations fora. She is author and editor of 15 books, including Roots of the Resistance, A History of Land Tenure in New Mexico, the American Book Award-winning An Indigenous Peoples History of the United States, and Loaded, A Disarming History of the Second Amendment. Not a Nation of Immigrants, Settler Colonialism, White Supremacy, and a History of Exclusion and Erasure will be published in this coming August 2021. So it's my pleasure to introduce Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz.
Thank you, Corinne. Thanks to all at Left Forum for organizing the panel and for the really wonderful work you have continued during the pandemic. And greetings to my fellow panelists and participants. I'm a historian. I call myself a militant historian, dedicated to deconstructing United States history, pointing to strategies for making real structural change. A historical materialist analysis of US settler colonialism is the first step. It is not simply historical, but is embedded in all structures of government, economy, and social relations. This history is reality, and we avoid it at our panel, at our peril. So in the founding and development of the United States, settler colonialism was more than continuation of a colonial structure that developed and replicated itself over time in the 170 years of British colonization in North America, preceding the founding of the United States as 13 states that were colonies, settler colonies hugging the Atlantic Ocean. So there was a continent to conquer ahead. The founders and settlers that constructed the United States were not an oppressed, colonized people as their origin narrative claims. The founding oligarchs were British citizens being restrained by the monarch from expanding the 13 colonies to enrich themselves and to expand plantation slavery. They were imperialists who visualized the conquest of the continent and achieving access to the Pacific and China. Achieving that goal required land and wealth and settler participation, the most important element. They devised a unique plan manifest in the 1787 Northwest Land Ordinance, created during the War of Independence by the Continental Congress, that was reenacted at independence by the US Congress in 1789. The provisions of the Northwest Land Ordinance were borrowed in part from the British colonial system of settler colonialism in Ulster, Ireland, and settler colonialism in the North American colonies. However, the founding of the United States settler colonial state was something new, unprecedented. The constitutional construction of a fiscal military settler state. with both ethnic cleansing of the native presence and chattel slavery, producing racial capitalism. The White Republic was the result. The Northwest Ordinance provided for eventual settler self-government once Euro-American settlers outnumbered the indigenous population. The Land Act guaranteed to the settlers property guarantees, civil rights, religious freedom, trial by jury, representational legislation, and public education. Settler democracy. That ultimate conclusion, however, was preceded by successive stages of colonial development, from military, ethnic cleansing and control to a federally appointed territorial government, to a semi-representational government, to finally admission into the United States as a state. This constituted a unit. The state constituted a unit of the fiscal military state and had an enormous amount of autonomy. The founders were unapologetic imperialists, following in the footsteps of British imperialism, but with the added conceit of an empire for liberty, as Thomas Jefferson conceived the future. Historian David Reynolds writes that Jefferson believed the US empire was destined to assume the responsibility to spread freedom around the world, starting with the North American continent and intervening abroad. US foreign policy was stamped with this concept and has provided the ideological motivation and rationalization for all US wars and interventions since and continuing. Though through the Northwest Ordinance, the United States created a unique land system among colonial powers, including Britain. In the US system, land itself, not just what was produced on the land, agriculture, mining, logging, grazing, and so forth, but land was the most important exchange commodity for the accumulation of capital and building the national treasury. In order to comprehend the apparently irrational genocidal policy of the US government toward the presence of native nations on the land for tens of thousands of years, the centrality of land sales in building the economic base of the US capitalist system must be the frame of reference. Although private property in land had long been a fact in Europe, it was demarcated by the contour of streams, rivers, tree lines, rock formations, mountains, and private property was reserved for the economic and political elite. The architects of the United States created something new under the sun, the plat system of privatizing land into marketable units, that is, real estate. The Northwest Ordinance spawned the public land survey system, a unique surveying method to plat, that is, to divide land, transforming it into property for sale and settling. Plots of 160 acres with sections of 4 plots or 640 acres. As the US took more land with the Louisiana Purchase, the Oregon Territory, and half of Mexico through 2 years of war, the government promised free land to Europeans and Euro-Americans for the purpose of recruiting and motivating settlers to squat on indigenous peoples' lands, and with indigenous resistance to the squatters, the army would be dispatched to ethnically cleanse the land. The pieces of paper, deeds representing units of land, made up the commodity market that built the United States capitalist system and remains its central factor today. The other main commodity until 1860 was human, the enslaved African body with its deed of sale. Historian Donald Harmon Atkinson aptly describes the implementation of the land ordinance. So the importance of the Northwest Land Ordinance was equal to that of the Constitution of 1787. It was its twin. It did not deal with any ethereal concepts such as the pursuit of happiness, rather the pursuit of land. And it declared in practical terms how the land from the Appalachian Mountains up to the Mississippi River was to be conquered. This was to be done by surveyors' chains, each 22 yards in length. The measuring began at an arbitrary point in the Ohio Territory, and invisible lines were drawn on the land to form a grid of perfect rectangles marked by cairns, iron bars, and the occasional brass plate cemented into a masonry base. Each of the rectangles had its own map reference. And as the US Imperium expanded, the grid eventually reached the Pacific coast and stretched between Mexico and British North America. The lines on the land not only conquered natural topography, but also made possible the liberation of parcels of land from their previous occupants, the indigenous peoples, the Mexican people, and their efficient allocation to newcomers. So this was the implementation of the fiscal military state. The capitalist state made for war in order to appropriate property. This brought the 100 years of wars that it took to get to the Pacific and to the parameters of the continental United States today. From the beginning of the surveys in the newly claimed Northwest Territory to the Pacific Ocean, the lands claimed by the surveys were already densely populated with indigenous peoples, 99% of them agrarian farmers, self-sufficient farmers, not commercial farmers. But the land was treated as terra nullius, unpopulated land. While the indigenous nations and communities reduced in numbers by genocidal warfare that caused displacement, starvation, crowded refugee situations, and resultant infectious diseases, were forced onto army patrolled reservations dependent on government rations. By 1845, the indigenous peoples of the large native agricultural nations of the South were forcibly relocated to west of the Mississippi, allowing the development of the Cotton Kingdom that created the highest GDP of any country in the world by 1845. This is important not only for understanding how settler colonialism defines the United States and all of its institutions, but also, as Mahmoud Mamdani has documented in his amazing new book, Neither Settler Nor Native, all of the defining institutions of settler colonialism as practiced in the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries were first developed in North America. The US tribal homeland was the prototype, not only for the South African Reserve, but also the Nazi concentration camp and for the partition of Palestine. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Roxanne. A really deeply informative and brilliant talk about the historical roots of the crisis, the institutional roots, as you pointed out, and the material basis, I think, as well, in terms of the US as the model, sort of fiscal military state, settler colonialism, genocide, enslavement, racial capitalism. So thank you so much for giving us that historical perspective. Our next speaker is Mireille Fanon Mendès-France. Mireille is the president of the Frantz Fanon Foundation, where she works specifically on the issues of decoloniality of power, knowledge, and being. She has contributed to numerous symposia and publications, both on legal issues, the right to self-determination and the sovereignty of peoples, fundamental rights and humanitarian law, and on structural racism and its consequences, enslavement, and reparation process. She has participated in numerous missions on political prisoners to Palestine, Chile, Colombia, as well as to the US. She was formerly a professor of literature and a consultant in cognitive education and mediation of learning and conflict resolution. As she also has worked as editor-in-chief at UNESCO. For 12 years, Mireille was a parliamentary assistant to the National Assembly from 2011 in France, that is. From 2011 to 2017, she was appointed expert of the Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent by the UN. And in 2009, she received the COGEP International Human Rights Award. Mireille, thanks so much for joining us today. Welcome. We can't hear you.
Mireille, you're unmuted.
I know. All done. It's okay? Is it okay now?
Yeah, we can hear you now. Yeah.
Okay, good. Sorry. Thank you, Karina, for the presentation. And I will take two short examples to see the complementarity between them. And in this example, there is the root of crisis described by Roxanne. The first example is actual Colombian situation, and the second one is annex some similar point with the Palestinian actual Palestinian situation. Since the end of April, the Colombian people in the majority of cities, sorry, I have to change my glasses, it's better. Since the end of April, the Colombian people in the majority of cities invite the street to denounce corruption, but especially the liberal policies taken by President Duque and his right-wing government by voting the Sustainable Solidarity Law that increased VAT on food, increased income tax from $656 per month. This government, which voted in 2019 a law financing granted to the richest, a decline in taxes that cost in the country, oh my God, a lot of money. Sorry, had been in search of a new cash receipts. Doing so, it indicates which part of the Colombian society goes in his favor. President Duque withdraws the law after a few days. Do not receive us. It will come back under new clauses and equally colonial. This law, so-called sustainable solidarity, unique and unworthy, perfectly illustrates what the coloniality of power is exercised on the racialized, marginalized, and precarious bodies. Make up under the terms sustainable solidarity, new keen interest of Euro-centered democracy, this law makes responsible the non-being of the country's budget deficit. To non-being to be solidarity, so that the bourgeoisie, comprador, and the latifundists are still enriching more and support without state of mind a government sold to the violence of an implacable financial system. All those living with monthly salaries that allow only to survive are enemies for President Duque and his government. And if they claim their right to oppose liberal policies, their right to dignify life, their right to freedom of expression, they become terrorists, manipulated by the FARC, and who lead the country to chaos. The only answer is the deployment of armed force, but also paramilitaries. Many of them have been trained in infiltration, intelligence, and also practiced by Israeli agents. These paramilitaries, through militias in the service of the state and the cartel of drugs, have never ceased their dirty works, even if the peace agreement have been signed since 2016, and particularly against Colombians most affected by the liberal law, namely Afro-Colombian and indigenous, including many political leaders and human rights defenders have been murdered. There have been more than 1,000 since 2016. Afro-Colombian and indigenous are the first victims of this massive and systematic violation. It is for the power and its affidavit to get their hands on thousands of hectares of land and on the gold deposit on which are living indigenous and Afro-Colombian communities. But it is important to continue using the same paradigm of domination that have been built in 2 stages in Colombia, and I could say all around the world. On the one hand, the colonization of the country since 1492 has been justified by the establishment of cultural racism, which has authorized the extermination of part of the indigenous people. On the other hand, the development of the country has been partly ensured by the enslavement of thousands of Africans arrived on the Pacific coast of Colombia during the transatlantic slave trade, which found its justification in biological racism confirming the hierarchy of humanity. Since then, both indigenous and Afro-Colombian still do not count, and it is particularly against them that state violence is exercised. These populations are racialized, dehumanized, and considered as a non-being. By dominant, we still do not recognize them, the status of being. By ever relegating them, by refusing them the right of the earth, yet guaranteed by a specific law, by assuming state racism, despite statement of intent of the Colombian state, among other things, law against racism that are part of the legislative corpus. However, they are totally ineffective. The Declaration of Good Conduct of the Colombian state, which respect of these 2 populations, constitute only an additional institutional lie that the liberal government handle at the desire. People are enduring, people prevent, and especially Afro-Colombians who are part of Colombian society completely apart. Victims of forced displacement, threat, retaliation, destruction of their homes and places of worship, an obligation to abandon to all their cultural and social references. Afro-Colombians, but also indigenous, are victims of ethnocide or even genocide in the sense that Raphael Lemkin suggests, since the policy aim, I quote, to destroy or to demine a whole national, religious or racial group by attacking some members of this group. This attack is a serious threat to life or for freedom, health, economic survival, or for all these conjugated factors. The culprits can be representative of the state or organized political or social group. The genocide aims at the national group as an entity, and the action in question are directed against individuals, not as quality, but as member of the national group, end quote. As soon as we understand why human rights defenders and union representatives are killed almost systematically. Afro-Colombian and indigenous, most of the time, ignored by all governments, are deprived of their fundamental rights because of structural racism that has allowed this population to be practically without constitutional rights until 1991. They continue to be invisibilized, and their voice is muzzled by the terror that the army and the paramilitaries are rained as soon as they claim their rights, but especially the end of structural racism erected in a state system. Thus, in Buenaventura, the construction of a deep-water port has been the theater of heinous massacre without the state alarming. Afro-Colombian fishermen were the subject of a ruthless fight to force them to leave their precarious home built on the lagoon. Structural racism is revealed and is brought to the eye of ignominy when it comes to dislodging Afro-Colombian or the indigenous of their territories while a law is supposed to protect them. What happened in Cali right now, where the army and paramilitary are sowing a state of terror in a totally military city, is not a surprise. In Colombia, the culture of repression and violence has become the rule. The government ensures that it is to avoid looting. As in many protest movements, we are entitled to wonder about the instrumentalization of groups on the assault of shops, even though some protesters can seize the opportunity of an open door or a broken showcase. The appeal to the army in the city of Cali recalls the one launched by Donald Trump, ready to make the army intervene to muzzle the protester voice and put a stop point to the overflows of demonstration after the death of George Floyd, in the name of the famous law and order, which will be taken up by many presidents, including that of France and Prime Minister of Israel. Faced with the suffocation of people, states calling for Euro-centered modernity and white supremacy refuse to listen to the voice of racialized, precarious non-being. Their reaction is identical. Police violence is customary, impunity is the rule, and if it is not enough, we do the army intervene with a massive confinement of so-called terrorists. Some countries claiming their democracy, given model in the world, have erected state violence in a social policy, as a social policy. The state violence, speaking with more or less intensity, marks for some countries the impossible or unfinished construction of a regulatory state of social relation. For others, the rupture arrived because after a conflict regulation space, some democratic states suppress this place of collective management. Thus decided the liberal capitalist system to which the majority of states presented their credentials, the people embarrassed. The Colombian people, including Afro-Colombian and indigenous, by refusing the liberal policy of his government embarrasses. It is exactly the same paradigm concerning Palestinians resisting to the illegal annexation of their land, the demolition of their homes and crops, the sacking of their mosques, the occupation of East Jerusalem, systematic arrest and arbitrary detention, administrative detention, embarrass. Since years and years, a veritable ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people is committed, and the international community prefer to compare them to terrorists or extremists. It forgets, or seems to forget, there is an occupier and unoccupied. For decades, the Palestinian people have been subjected to successive massacres, and the Israeli state has enjoyed total impunity. When will the international community wake up and restore legitimacy to international law? We are waiting for the ICC to do the job for which it was created, which is that crimes committed on Palestinian lands are brought to justice and those responsible punished. When will it assume its responsibility? When will the international community will assume its responsibility in guaranteeing the legitimate right of the Palestinians to the recognition of the state and their capital, Jerusalem? So many violations of international humanitarian law and international law. The international community unable to live up to its responsibilities under international law is content to ask both sides to show restraint and end the fighting. It should sanction the state of Israel for committing war crime and practicing an apartheid policy towards the Palestinian people. They are ready, this international community is ready to sanction certain states of South, like Venezuela, Cuba, and others. But when it concerns Israel or other European states, as France, for example, and what is doing in Mali, there is no sanction, absolutely no sanction. When these fundamental rights, the right of people to self-determination are violated, whether here or elsewhere, we must today agree that the responsibility lies largely with this community incapable of ensuring the fundamental principle of the Charter and its obligation. And this international community is participating de facto in this violation by its silence, leaving the assassins free to kill without any sanction. Do not leave them alone. Some people have already taken aware that they were no longer welcome, others will follow. Let's resist the world of compartmentalized colonial domination. Let's resist the Manichaean world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mireille, for helping us draw connections between the ongoing violence that we see and the framework that Roxanne shared around the ongoing processes of violence, extraction, dispossession that are part of the settler colonialist, racial capitalist state states that we confront, particularly in the context of the empire of liberty that Roxanne alluded to. Next, it is my profound honor to introduce Rabab Abdulhadi, who is the founding director and senior scholar of the Arab and Muslim Ethnicities and Diaspora Studies program at San Francisco State University. Before joining SFSU, she was the first director of the Center for Arab American Studies at the University of Michigan, Dearborn. She is a widely published as a scholar, activist, and a 10-year UN-based journalist. She has taught at Birzeit, NYU, Hunter College, Yale, and American University in Cairo, and has been honored by academic, teaching, and community awards by her students, peers, and community organizations. She has co-led and co-organized and led several groundbreaking delegations to Palestine, South Africa, Cuba, Vietnam, Seville, Andalusia, and stressed in-depth critical and reciprocal solidarities, such as Indigenous and women of color feminists, U.S. prisoner solidarity, and teaching Palestine, pedagogical praxis, and the indivisibility of justice. She is currently compiling and analyzing oral histories of Palestinian activism and editing a volume that challenges colonial narratives and calls for decolonizing the curriculum and ending the erasure of Palestine through education. So welcome, Rabab. So honored to have you here.
Thank you for having me. Can you hear me well? No static. Okay. So first of all, I really want to thank the Left Forum for having me and for giving us the opportunity to engage in this teaching, to organize and work together. As many of you may know, actually, our AMID studies courses, Arab and Muslim Ethnicities and Diaspora Studies, courses have been reduced by 60% since the before and after, since the pandemic has started, under the pretext that this is budget concerns by San Francisco State University, which, if we know from our studies of settler colonialism, neoliberalism, and racial capitalism, this is about creating facts on the ground to get rid of oppositional and resistance movements, including within the academy. Actually, this summer also, 2 of my classes were canceled. I asked the university to allow me to teach the courses in the summer, July or August, because now there is a lot of interest in Palestine and Arab and Muslim communities. And they said there is a budget crisis, which is very interesting because California State University has a slush of $1.5 billion. So I will just leave it at that. The second point I wanted to say is I wanted to add my voice to Rob from the beginning about the problematic use of Zoom and other social tech, private corporations, and the need for the movements to actually provide alternatives for platforms for us to work within, not only because Zoom has silenced us and censored us twice and actually vetoed our curriculum, the content of our curriculum, which is a huge violation even by the liberal context of academic freedom, but also social media companies like Facebook also are engaging in Instagram and engaging in silencing hundreds and thousands of accounts and so on. We know what's going on, and actually have shut down our Ahmed Facebook page completely, which we're trying to reinstate, and there is a link that some folks will share with you. The other thing that I would say, and I think it's very connected to what I would say at the end, is I'm really happy that the Left Forum is what the Left Forum is today. Because I remember from my history, and I do social history, contextual analysis, and I remember there was a point when we actually asked to have a table at the social forum, and the social forum asked to see what the content of the literature table would be. And we said, no, we don't want to have it, because they wanted to make sure there may be some things that might be comfortable or not comfortable to our particular liberal Zionists in the movement. So I'm really happy that this is the board of the social forum, and you're doing this and having us here. I also want to acknowledge that San Francisco State sits on the indigenous stolen people's land. And I want to also give a shout out to all the fallen, including the people who have fallen for a very long time ago, the 215 unmarked graves for indigenous kids in Turtle Island, North America, British, quote unquote, British Columbia, the people who have fallen in multiple uprisings in the United States historically since the settler colonialism project has started, and the kidnapping and the enslavement of African people. And also I want to mention the recent Palestinians. Yesterday, a recent person who had just died, Muhammad Hamayel, 16-year-old, in the village of Beta. And there now we know that the toll has been 400 people. There's actually 2 other martyrs. 400 have been injured with live bullets, with rubber bullets, with all sorts of attacks. And it's very interesting because Beta actually fits with the questions you've asked me to address, the whole question of settler colonialism. The protest in Beta, which is the south of my hometown, Nablus, has been going on because the settlers are trying to build and expand another colonial outpost for them in Beta. But also Beta is sort of marked, and people read the New York Times, very much ingrained in people's minds, because during 1980s, in the 80s, there was a huge coverage about the village of Beta and an Israeli settler, Terza Purat, everybody remembers her name. I'm not sure how many people are going to remember Muhammad Hamayel's name, who was killed while on a hike on the mountains outside Beta. And there was accusations that Palestinians have attacked and killed the settler. And it turns out that the settler was killed by the bullets of the armed guard, another settler who actually was supposed to be protecting the young settlers who were going on a hike on the mountains of Palestine, which is, if you think about it, connecting what Toussaint was talking about, Roxanne and Mireille, it's very much brings together the whole question of how the ecological degradation, the environmental the attacks, the imprisonment, the incarceration, the erasure and the genocide against indigenous people. Because despite the fact that the Israeli military controlling Beta knew that the settler woman was killed, young woman was killed by another settler. Nonetheless, over 20 homes of Palestinians were demolished. Palestinians were arrested, many martyrs fell. And Muhammad actually, who was killed yesterday, belongs to a family of martyrs. His father, his grandfather, his aunt, his uncle have already been killed by Israel in the past. So we can continue. Why is this really important? You've asked me to speak about 5 questions, so I'm going to try to make sure that I actually combine as much as possible, and hoping we can have more, especially with your ongoing classes and so on. So one of the questions you asked is, what is the origins of today's crisis in Palestine, in particular connection to settler colonialism? And I'm going to use, and the second question was about the features of the current intifada, significance of feminist organizing, historical role of international solidarity, and what do we do next? As scholar, activists, and public intellectuals, we always have to ask, what do we do next? What's next? So to start with, I want to actually take some of the dominant discourses that are going on today and basically try to see if we can deconstruct them as we go along. So the first question, there is a lot of coverage today that presents the current quote unquote crisis or conflict, which we do not refer to it as such, we refer as a colonial, settler colonial, racist state that is trying to actually erase completely Palestinian and erase Palestinians from their land and displace them from their land. And what is being presented today is that this is all about Netanyahu, the current prime minister of Israel, I guess until tomorrow, is trying to solve his problem, his crisis of staying in power, because A, he has a greed hold on power, which is not untrue, but 2, because he wants to evade being held accountable for the multiple corruption, stealing from budget and so on and so forth, which is very interesting because Israel keeps telling us that it is the most accountable, the most transparent, the most democratic, the most civilized, the best state for its people and so on. And I guess its people becomes a question mark. That's not what it is about. It is partly about, of course, Netanyahu is trying to stay in power, but it really has to, and this is very interesting because the New York Times and other papers are actually presenting it. And Roger Cohen, who is one of the main intellectuals, was very interesting, was sent to an assignment in France to basically theorize how to contest Macron and the French government's attack, Islamophobic, racist, surveillance, imprisonment, racial violence against Arab, Muslim, African people, the increasing incarceration that is going on by the French state, which is a colonial power, which Mireille has talked about, but I'm also connecting what Toussaint is talking about. But he was sent there to actually theorize that. So that seemed to be one of his tasks, okay, to kind of like figure out, make sense, make legible to people who are reading that, no, this is not really about racism. This is not about attacks of people who are studying critical colonial studies, which has been, by the way, in the works in France for a very long time, despite the major intellectual, Jean-Paul Sartre and Foucault and so on, who didn't talk about it. But this has been going on sort of underground because the dominant discourses do not speak about that, and they all speak about laicite, and they speak about the secularism and the enlightenment and the fraternity and so on and so forth, because how could France not be civilized? And how could the United States not be civilized and so on? So there is this whole, and now Roger Cohen has been sent to Israel to provide the news analysis. So now there is sort of like an attempt in the New York Times in particular, but other pro-Israel, pro-Zionist mainstream, to actually reaffirm what Blinken, the Secretary of State, and what the United States, Biden and so on, are presenting Israel to be. That it is just a democracy that just has a few problems, just that it's an isolated incident. It is a random, it's accidental what's going on. This is something, everything is going to go back to normal. What's a new government? And now there is an attempt to reinvent Naftali Bennett, who's a settler leader, just because he stepped down from being the leader of the Yesha Council, which is settler council, does not make him stop being a settler and advocating settler ideology. So they present him as a former settler. lead, because he used to be stepped down from that position. It's very, very interesting how we can think about, like Kissinger was Secretary of State during Vietnam. Just because Kissinger is no longer Secretary of State does not erase his legacy and his theorizing against all sorts of people and involvement and intervention in many places around the world and role in actually around Vietnam and so on. So it's very, very interesting the ways in which it gets constructed. And part of the reason it gets constructed that way is because Israel is presented as the United States as an exceptional project that is somewhat about democracy, but it has some problems here and there that need to be fixed. And this is what the United States Secretary of State Blinken keeps saying again and again, that we have when he responded to Ilhan Omar, for example, a couple of days ago, he said, oh, we have faith in the Israeli courts, which is very interesting because it's also connected to what's happening in Sheikh Jarrah, because the Israeli Attorney General has decided to step away from weighing in the quote-unquote Israeli Supreme Court case around the Sheikh Jarrah, the neighborhood in Jerusalem, whose families are protesting day in and day out and refusing to be moved, and basically people from around the world are supporting them. And there was also the whole question of the resistance in Gaza, basically trying to actually give support, and warned again and again and again. And we can talk about more about that background. That was one story and disappeared from the news. What happened with the Aqsa Mosque, what happened with Jerusalem, what happened with all of this. There's a lot of things to talk about. So there is an attempt to resuscitate, to reinvent Israel at a time that it has a huge crisis now, a huge crisis of public relations, huge crisis to actually with the Israeli public, huge crisis with the Israeli activists and leftists and peace movement who are leaving. Some people are saying there is at least from the 1,000 people arrested in Lidda, there was 150 Israeli leftists who was beaten up and arrested. The 850 others were Palestinians that were arrested. But there is this attempt to do that. There is a huge crisis that they're trying to. But it really, in effect, it is a settler colonial project. It is a settler colonial project that we talk about. If we want to talk about the roots, it's very much about capitalism. It's very much about the colonial project. It's very much about the Zionist movement connecting with the colonial powers of Europe and telling the colonial powers of Europe, look, you have a problem with Jews. You would like to get rid of the Jews. This is the quote unquote, the Jewish problem of Europe, which Marx spoke about as the Jewish question. We will take care of the Jews and put them in another colony. And they were searching for different places. Then Palestine ended up to be the one. And you can get rid of the Jews. And the colonialism, Zionism connection is manifested in the Rhodes-Herzl connections, in Jabotinsky, in many others that we don't actually have time to talk about now. But there is a huge history about that we can demonstrate and discuss. But it was also around kind of like trying to address a very serious problem of anti-Semitism in Europe, except the Zionist movement constructed the question of anti-Semitism as an exceptional problem to the question of racial, ethnic, and national racism that actually in Marx, in his essay on the Jewish question, speaks about it very clearly and says, this is really about the discrimination, this is about capitalism, this is about exploitation, this is about singling out communities and so on, and actually the way to do it is for the Jews and people who are advocating for Jews and so on to link together and align themselves with all sorts of people who are fighting for justice, who are fighting for a different society, who are fighting for socialism and so on. And that will take care of it. And of course, we know from the history and from our experiences that this is not, none of the problems are easily resolved. And I think, and I want to contest here the ways in which in some leftist quarters, it's actually said that we deal with the socioeconomic issue and then the racial question takes a long time because the socioeconomic issues have not been dealt with either. So I want to actually put the racial and the ethnic and the national question back into the pot of thinking about the material conditions of what settler colonialism, what capitalism, what colonialism, how these projects are connected with each other, how are they connected with the question of gender and sexual injustices and justice, how are they connected in the question of exploitation, environmental degradation, i.e. I really want us to keep thinking about the framework of the indivisibility of justice, that all of these issues are very much part and parcel of they make the same bigger picture. So that's one of the questions. The second question is about the intifada. Okay, so what is it? Is this an intifada? What is an intifada and what is not? The reason people say it's an intifada, some people call it intifada of unity. Some people like to have like attached names. I want to just say, is this an intifada? Does it make an intifada? Think about what are the material conditions for social movement analysis and what is going on. And I think definitely we are seeing very similar things to what happened, quote unquote, in the intifada of the stone that people call the first intifada, or what happened in the Aqsa intifada, and people call the second intifada. And there are similarities, but there are also differences. So first, in terms of similarities, let's just say the Iskra, referring to the October Revolution, the straw that broke the camel's hair was in 1987, the Israeli truck that basically bumped into Palestinian workers in Gaza, killed 4 workers. It was actually an accident, but Palestinians, there is already boiling sentiments and so on. So people started protesting and so on. In the second intifada, Aqsa intifada, it was Ariel Sharon on September 28, 2000, going with thousands of Israeli soldiers and dogs inside the Aqsa mosque, which precipitated it. But like now also, what is going on, whether it is kind of like the attacks and the killing and so on, this is something that has been going on for a very long time. So I want to mention the 3 different points that have been happening that we are watching. The question of the Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan, which Silwan and Sheikh Jarrah are 2 neighborhoods of Jerusalem, but they're actually very indicative to all the neighborhoods in the various parts where Israel controls. Since 1967 occupation of the West Bank, Gaza Strip, Sinai, the Golan Heights, or it is the lands that Israel has occupied since 1948 when Israel was founded. And it has to always do, and it has to do with the history of the Israeli settler colonial project from the time colonization of Palestine started. In the sense that many people do not know that actually majority of the lands in Palestine do not even belong to the Israeli state. They are administered by something called the Jewish National Fund. The Jewish National Fund was a body, quasi-governmental body, coordinates with the Israeli government, but coordinates also with the World Zionist movement, in saying that all the lands are in trust for the Jewish people. So any Jewish person anywhere, including the parents of Naftali Bennett, who were actually from San Francisco, or including where Netanyahu grew up in Pennsylvania or so on, or Baruch Goldstein, the Jewish doctor who actually killed 229 worshippers in Hebron, or any of these settlers, Kahane and so on, belongs actually, they have rights to the lands of where Palestine historically was, and now to the West Bank. They do not have rights to the lands in Gaza, only because Israel had to withdraw from Gaza in 2005, the same way Israel had to withdraw from the south of Lebanon in 2000 because of the resistance of the people. These are the only 2 places from which Israel withdrew, not as a result of a conciliatory, a colonial normalizing agreement with Arab countries, just like Egypt, Camp David, and so on. And I won't go further than that, but this is part of the question of the land, taking over the land of Palestinians continuously, destroying lands, destroying homes that Palestinians built because Israel does not grant permits. There is something in Israel called the law of return, which means any Jewish person from anywhere around the world can land in Tel Aviv airport and become Israeli citizen, and thus have access to the land of Palestine before the Palestinians. There is a law called absentee, that any Palestinians who have been displaced in 1948 and were not able to return, their land becomes state land, i.e. administered by the Jewish National Fund, and just allowable to Jewish Israelis to actually to deal with. There are several issues that are going on. There is the question of Judaization of Jerusalem that's going on, also including the old city, that is happening. There is also the question of Lidda, for example. People talk about Lidda and what happened, and they call the racial violence. And Lidda was a Palestinian city that was completely destroyed because there was a massacre after Israel was founded on July 10th, 11th in 1948. That was a massacre in which people of Lidda were destroyed and they had to leave. And I know about this stuff also from the history, but also from actually going with delegations. So we can actually speak about that, what we saw, where we saw, and so on. So this is one of the things. Is it like the earlier Intifada? Yes, there is. The other thing is that it's like earlier Intifada because there has been organizing on the ground. So unlike the surprise by the mainstream and the world when Arab Revolution started, that, wow, there is a revolution going on in Egypt, in Tunisia, and so on, that there has been all this organizing by trade unions, by women, by students, by workers, by people who are talking about rights and against police state and so on and so forth, privatization. There has been organizing going on historically in Palestine, historically escalated, gets to the point where actually the iskra, the spark starts, and then there are groups who actually start organizing. We're seeing some of the stuff now. There are some differences in the sense that today, similarities with the Aqsa Intifada, but differences with the Intifada of the Stone or the 1936-39 revolt and so on, in the sense that now we have this kind of like the Palestinian Authority that is supposed to be a state, which is not a state, has nothing except the name, okay? But there is nothing, I mean, even the Palestinian president himself has to get a permit from Israel in order for him to travel from one place to the other. I mean, the Palestinian president himself cannot go from one place to the other without that. How am I doing for time? Am I okay? I'm okay, right?
No, we're actually at time, Rabab. Thank you so much.
Okay. No, I just I need to mention a couple, if you don't mind. Okay. So then the two other points that I wanted to mention that I can talk about them later on is the question of the feminist organizing and the emphasizing that this is something, this is anti-colonial, this is part and parcel of the movement. This is also not exceptional. Unlike the Orientalist, Islamophobic, colonialist discourses that claim that there is exceptionality and so on. And then the final thing I would say is that there is a history of solidarities and internationalisms collaborating with Palestine, not only in the US, that has been led by people in the American Indian movement, Black Panther Party, Black Liberation, the Chicano movement, the Asian solidarities and people connected with Vietnam, Philippines, and so on, but also with a very big layer of anti-imperialist, anti-Zionist, anti-colonialist, anti-capitalist organizers that have been part of it, which leads me to the last question is, what do we do then? What does it mean? I think it's really encouraging that there is union organizing going on. There is Block the Boat. PSC CUNY has come up with a resolution and so on. So I think that there's something that we think about, how do we build on those issues, but how do we also understand what's going on in order for us to be able to defeat the discourses of submission, subjugation, and defeat that are propagated by colonialism, and build international solidarity to come together.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that brilliant analysis, Rabab, and drawing so many connections between the Palestinian liberation movement and the other struggles that so many of us are connected to here, against settler colonialism, against racial capitalism, the Black Power struggle, and for talking about how crucial it is that we really have a radical analysis of what is happening in Palestine. So much of the media today tends to just focus on the recent escalation of violence without looking at how settler colonial apartheid violence is always there, as is resistance, as you've so eloquently pointed out. So I think we will, and thank you again. I just want to thank you again to all of the speakers. Really honored to be here with you today. And I think we will, we do have a one hand up. Uju and I have prepared a few questions as well, but maybe we'll start with the question from the audience, and then we can move in to some of the questions that we've prepared as well. So would I see here, let's see. Oh, okay, great. Matt is going to, I see here that Taminku, oh, I can't see the name anymore. It didn't come up.
But I think they've been added here.
Oh, okay. Okay, Tom Kino, would you like to ask your question? Hello, Tom? Is Tom there? Oh, they haven't. Tom, you've got to unmute. Okay, maybe we'll come back to Tom. Okay, in the meantime, shall we just move on? Okay, great. So
Karina, you've muted.
Sorry. Okay, so we have we'd like to, and also we would like to open it up to the speakers as well to ask each other questions. So please, if you have questions for the other speakers, feel free at any moment to interject and ask. Well, this has been a period of intensified crises. It has also been one of remarkable resistance and solidarities, and that has come across so clearly in all of the talks and brilliant presentations you've made here today. From the abolition movement within and outside prison walls to the uprising or intifada in Palestine, in Colombia, and the land back struggles here in Turtle Island. We also see the conditions of crises create potential for new solidarities. And I think, again, many of you have touched on this already. As we see, for example, in the case of US imperialism, and I think Mireille pointed out in particular, for example, in the case of Colombia, how the sharing of material, not just in terms of weapons, but also counterinsurgency training from Israel to the US to Colombia through Plan Colombia. And I think that those kinds of connections are really important to draw out and to think about. But also to think about how they have created the sort of conditions because by virtue of imperialism and these connections between settler colonialism and racial capitalism, how they've created the conditions for new forms of solidarity, building on older forms of solidarity, which have also been touched on, but also new forms of solidarity today. Yeah, so Uju, do you want to, so should we ask hers and then we'll have to answer? Yeah.
Kind of a two-part question, right? So there's the question of emerging and strengthened forms of solidarities, and then connected to this, one thing that we've seen historically and in the present is the way that power also responds to organizing, right? So ranging from state-sanctioned murder to lawfare, for example, here in New York State, an executive order saying that public institutions supporting boycott, divestment sanctions will be sanctioned themselves. And likewise in Texas, a recent state law punishing municipalities for defunding the police. We also, of course, see attempts to appropriate and dilute our movements and struggles through, for example, distorting our demands and the language we use to frame them. These are not new tactics, but ones that we can learn from historically and that we need to think through together. So we want to ask you, in addition to thinking about new and emergent forms of solidarities, how can we also continue to grow our organizing and resistance in the face of crises and intensified repression?
I can talk very quickly. One, in terms of the imperialism, I mean, historically, we spoke about it, but historically, Israel has actually collaborated with all these repressive regimes. There is an archive of that, but also there is something newer about that there is a project called Deadly Exchange that actually shows where Israel and the US have been collaborating militarily in terms of quote unquote police training, in terms of kind of how do you deal with quote unquote crowd control. And it's very, very interesting because it takes me back also to the anti-apartheid movement that in the 1987 Intifada, when Rabin declared might, force, and beating, breaking the arms of Palestinian kids who throw stones to kind of disable them and punish them, Israel was asked, how come you're not using water cannons? They said, oh, we send them to South Africa. So that was, at the time, they were using them to crowd control. So there is a lot of organizing, and I think it has escalated since 9/11, 2001, in the something that is actually, it's really important to think about the economic aspects of it, the securitized industries that has to do with surveillance, that has to do with the tech industry, Silicon Valley, that has to do with the weapon, that has to do with very advanced weaponry, that has to do with psychological warfare. There is all of this stuff, and there are multiple organizations. There is an Israeli organization called Who Profits, and always says that Israel, for example, needs a war every 5 years or so in order for them to show proven in battle and show the tanks and so on. And this is very much connected to the question of what's going on, like the former chief in Ferguson was trained in Israel, chief of police, that when Michael Brown was killed. All of this stuff is going on again and again and again. I think it's really important for us to draw, but there is also solidarities among people. So by the same, and I think this is something everybody knows, that people in Gaza send messages to Ferguson telling them how to deal with tear gas, because there has been a long period since the 50s of people in the US. It's not like people in the US have not actually been bombed, like Move, have not been subjected to tear gas, have not been subjected to, that it's just not known internationally. So it's kind of like, I think there is a discrepancy between what is known and what is not known, which is really important for us to actually produce that kind of knowledge. But there is a lot of solidarities going on, and we can talk about all of them, but I don't want to spend time about that. I just want to speak about the whole question of BDS and the economic, this week, the economic week in Palestine has just ended. It's a week that people in the 48 areas announced in order to actually support Palestinian economy. And there is the boycott as well that's going on in order to stand up and hold Israel accountable, not just any other country, like Mireille was speaking to international law, but also how do we also teach together? How do we do a lot of the stuff, open classrooms with our colleagues in Palestine, in Lebanon, around the world? How do we actually learn with each other? How do we can do delegations now because of COVID, but how is it that we can build reciprocal solidarities and learn from the histories? And historically, the movements have trained with each other. This is not the time because we are at a different stage in the movement, possibly, but I think there are a lot of ways for us to build stronger things. But for that, we also have to be open to kind of think about time zone, think about language, think about translation, think about all of, so people who are on the ground are able to participate and not have the imperial language of English become the mediator or the social media or whatever going on.
Wonderful. Thanks for that, Rabab. I see Roxanne had your hand up as well. You're muted.
Sorry. You mentioned the land back movement, that central demand of maybe singular demand right now of a consensus of Native peoples, from tribal councils to very grassroots organizers. But I don't think most people really know what that means outside of Native people. But actually, you know, there are, in US territory is 2.27 billion acres of land, including Alaska, Hawaii, and the continental United States. 30% of that land is federal land. And it is not owned by the federal government. There was never any treaties. This is land that was taken without treaty, without agreement, which is against US law. So they can't sell it. They can only lease it. The ranchers, timber people have lobbied endlessly, huge corporations lobbying for privatization. And the government never comes out and tells them the truth. We don't own this land. It was taken illegally. So all of that land should be restored to the appropriate Native nations, some of whom have no land at all. And none of them have enough for any kind of real nation building processes of real, you know, really autonomous entities. So I think what that means is National Park Service, forests, parklands. I think there'd be tremendous pushback, but I don't see much on the left, of understanding and making these kinds of demands of the restoration of all of those lands illegally taken, or negotiations about that land and new treaties being made. So I just think that's really important. If there's a lot of lip service of solidarity with Indigenous people's struggles, but I rarely ever see it spelled out, beyond the XL pipeline or, specific kinds of things, which is good, but there, land back really means something serious and big, and which would totally change the United States in every way, in good ways, that I think we don't look ahead. What do we want in the future for this place to look like?
Thank you, Roxanne, and Rabab for helping us think through questions of, again, how do we even begin to think about and grow our knowledge of solidarities that have existed in order to continue to grow those that we have today, and concretely, what does liberation then mean, right? What does land back mean? What do how do we move beyond slogans, right, to kind of what concrete what liberation means concretely. Do other folks, Mireille, Toussaint, do you have any kind of responses to the kind of questions that we posed, and or other thoughts or reflections based on what Roxanne and Rabab or others have shared? Okay.
What about, I was wondering, Toussaint, if you can, and sorry to put you on the spot, and please feel free to ignore the question, but if you could talk a little bit about how you understand the relationship of the abolition movement here to some of the other struggles that have been discussed by the presenters, because I think there are some really crucial connections to be made there. Thanks.
Sure. So abolition organizing is really grounded in the really the struggle to both get rid of particular forms of repressive state power, but also, as many abolitionist organizers and intellectuals consistently remind us, and we've seen repeatedly, indeed, the need to kind of replace those particular forms of kind of repressive state power with new institutions. Sometimes those are envisioned as sort of new forms of governance, but oftentimes, and really, I think the best example is to kind of look at those as being really like popular institutions, like bottom-up democratic institutions. And kind of when I like to talk about abolition, one of the instances and examples that I think is kind of most, that really opens up our way of thinking about it in a way that simply isn't a question of like, what do we want to get rid of or what are we trying to negate, but also really what are we trying to kind of, what are we trying to create and what sort of world are we envisioning, is the way in which W.E.B. Du Bois in Black Reconstruction talks about abolition democracy, and really talks about abolition as a democratic practice and as a way in which, and I think starts to speak to some of what we're talking about here, when we generally envision and sort of are kind of led to think about what democracy entails in the kind of bourgeois kind of social order, it's a very narrowly circumscribed, right? It's very narrowly defined in terms of what what democracy is and sort of what we can imagine it to be, and even sort of to what ends can it be wielded. And Du Bois reminds us of the ways in which abolition is really a democratic practice, and it really is part of the way in which we can expand the approach to thinking about what democratic demands mean beyond simply every 4 years or 5 years or what have you, going to the ballot box. More broadly, how we can be in the process of reconstructing our economy, our society as a whole. And we should understand ourselves as being sovereign enough to completely say, this is not how life should be lived or what have you, and be in the practice of doing away either with the particular kind of state institutions or broader sort of social relations that are beyond the pale, and many, as we're understanding it, and change things. So that's one thing. And oftentimes it's very narrowly, abolishing police, abolishing prisons, but I really think we need to sort of speak to it at a broader level. And part of one thing that I think is worth noting about how we're just having this conversation is, obviously there are these questions of solidarity, whether it's a kind of popular grassroots solidarity amongst oppressed peoples, or whether it's the sort of solidarity and alliances amongst kind of ruling classes and kind of oppressor nations, settler colonial projects and what have you, and which solidarity is going to sort of win out. But there also, I think, for those of us, particularly in the U.S., at least the opportunity that abolition offers to sort of think about the ways in which the kind of very limited worldview that we have often doesn't allow us much space to talk about settler colonialism, to talk about the United States as a settler colonial project, to see the ways in which the particular forms of settler colonialism in the U.S., as Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz was speaking to, have laid the foundation for other settler colonial projects, have inspired them, and have been deeply intertwined in the way in which those projects have been carried forward, and the way in which we could begin to sort of not only think about but also put into practice a kind of decolonial practice here that is about uprooting settler colonialism in the U.S. And that the part of the danger of kind of reframing the conversation in that way, and also for instance, like digging into the history of the anti-apartheid movement and other sort of instances of those kind of settler colonial, forms of international solidarity around questions of settler colonialism, really force the question domestically in terms of whether the forms of not only apartheid, but deeper colonial practices that have been carried out here. So those are a couple of things that come to mind. But I also think it's important to understand that part of what we also need to be in the practice of doing is just understanding how much our own kind of framing around abolition and kind of our own history of abolitionist movements have also opened the horizon to talk about different forms of kind of revolutionary practice. And I think we're kind of beginning to kind of enter a moment politically where part of the ways in which we've talked about abolition over the past couple decades have really opened kind of some of the door in terms of thinking about how do we think about not only sort of like reimagining the kind of world we want to see, but also how do we think about organizing in concrete ways and building the sort of alliances, fronts, kind of grassroots movements, what have you, that can really build the sort of force that's necessary to challenge the particular kind of ruling class dynamics that we see here in the United States and more broadly internationally at this moment in time.
Thank you so much, Toussaint, for helping us kind of, I think your comments around abolition democracy and the idea of thinking about whether we kind of different forms, right? Whether they be experiments, whether we think about it as dual power, whether we think about it as kind of abolition, both as a short-term strategy and long-term vision, right? Also speaks to what Rabab was saying earlier about the idea of, right, the organizing that is always going on, even if it is not visible to those outside, and the groundwork that is necessary to constantly be laying in building for our movements, those spaces where we actually envision and practice freedom together. And so it's not just about what we're tearing down, as you say, but what we actually need to build up, whether it's in place of the state or whether it's in place of kind of the repressive forces of the police and troubling ideas of safety. I see Mireille has a hand up, so we're going to move to Mireille, and then we have a question from the audience as well.
Just regarding the solidarity, one comment comes to my mind, because it's always very well appreciated to speak about solidarity, but what kind of solidarity do we want? If it is just for denounce the structural racism, but that's all, or we denounce also the illegal occupation of Palestine, or the ways African is under treated by international financial institutions and certain countries, the plunge of the natural resources. Is it okay? But for me, solidarity is something else. We have to think how to deconstruct or to think differently about it concerns the paradigm of domination. How we can decolonize the paradigm of domination concerning racial racism, structural racism, how we can think differently the paradigm of this paradigm of domination. And one of the work we can do in terms of solidarity is to underline to the people what does it mean to be racialized and where it's coming from. What does it mean to be occupied and where it's coming from? And also, as Roxanne underlined about on the lines in US, but it is also the case in where I am right now in French Antilles, and how the lands were taken, were stolen by the colonizer. And what does it mean to be solidar, for example, in solidarity with Haiti right now, where the actual president refused to leave the presidency, as he is no more elected president since February. What does it mean? It's not, I think we have to think solidarity in political terms and to not accept certain compromission. In France, we have this regarding when we talk about racial structural racism and colonial thinking with this structural racism, even from the left part of the French social movement, there is a shift when we say, no, we don't want just a claim for end of racism. We want, and this claim, this particular claim, has to come from the victim of the structural racism, and not only from the white people or associated white people. And it is very difficult to make understandable this position. We don't want the voice of the victim as not to be taken in hostage by the others. And the solidarity begins by to accept the voice of the victim, of the first impacted person. And when we talk about Haiti, for example, it's not the solidarity has to come from Asian people inside Haiti or as a diaspora, but not we have not to impose our view on Haiti. What could be Haiti view from our perspective or point of view? No, it's what wants the Asian people as a model to live, what they decide for themselves. And it is exactly the same thing for Africa, because we know if we are working on this issue of paradigm of domination still since 1492, we know we can't succeed to get emancipation of people, and particularly from racialized people, without emancipation of African continent. And we know also what is happening in Palestine is the result of the willing of the international community to do as they did in 1948, and therefore we need to think what kind of change have to be introduced. I'm sorry, but I try to organize my thinking. And for example, when we are speaking, when we say, okay, self-determination for every state, okay, but what does it mean when states are still colonized or under colonial yoke or under colonial constraint by other, like in Mali, for example, and now French decide to leave Mali, and it will be, I'm sure in the coming months, it will be like it was, and it is still in Libya, veritable chaos, and we are responsible of that. But therefore, we are obliged to think about what does it mean exactly? Universal. What does it? Is it universal? Is it share? It could be shared by every state, every country, and I think really, in terms of solidarity, we need also to think about what does it mean exactly solidarity, and what do we want it to be achieved with solidarity, and which kind of solidarity. For me, it's really exactly where I am. Because, for example, I don't want anymore demonstrate with people claiming end of racism, but in the same time, these people refuse to see the victim of racism having some meeting all together, not non-mixed meeting. I refuse to demonstrate with them, even if I'm solidar, fundamentally solidar. That's why I think we have really to think about what does it mean solidarity. It is not an empty box like that where we can put everything. We have to define exactly in a political way what it is. I'm sorry to be long, but
No, thank you so
I
much.
was thinking openly.
So
Freely.
critical, right? We learn that through praxis, right? Through practice, and it's so important to kind of bring us back to that question that it's not assumed, right? And we have to think. I think Toussaint, as you gestured, also about what it means to think about solidarity, particularly from the position of within the United States, the belly of the beast, but also kind of how we kind of build what solidarity does mean and where we forge it and where it's powerful. As Rabab, you were also signaling towards.
In which world,
Marina,
do we want to live? In which world do we want to live exactly? Under the paradigm of capitalist, liberal and capitalist system, or absolutely differently, where we can share and where we can be, where we can the humanity be human.
Yeah. Oh yeah, please, Roxanne,
Yeah.
go ahead. Oh, or was that Roxanne?
It was me.
No.
Rabab,
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. I was actually going to sort of like continue being conversation with what you said, Mireille. I definitely agree. I do think that solidarity is a very fraught concept that actually requires much more unpacking. I think also the point of view of the victim, but also the question of the agency. So I want to think, I mean, there is a very big, in Palestine, let's say anti-colonial solidarity movement. I say Palestine, not Palestinian, because I don't want to only talk about Palestinians, because if you think of Palestine as a liberatory, emancipatory project, as transnationally imagined, then we can, there is something in the movement about kind of like not actually hearing how people are articulating. So I think kind of like I'm building what you're saying, Mireille, is that the agency, when people say, this is how we think about it, this is what we want, the people say, no, you really don't know, you don't know, we're going to tell you how it is. So I think that is, and that is one of the questions, but then which Palestinian voices you want to listen to, because there are different perspectives. And not all the perspectives are the same. And there are different political projects, there are different political ideologies, and there are different ways of seeing the world. And I think always like, you know, I always say, okay, indivisibility of justice, but what indivisibility of justice means to me might not mean the same thing to other people, even if we agree we want to have an overcharging framework and so on. At one point, we kind of like, a lot of us, some of us who are kind of like old lefties and so on, leftists, we think about kind of like, okay, so we will go until here with each other, then we'll go farther away and so on. So that's one aspect of it, that also these models are really good to kind of think about, and think about what works, what doesn't work. Not throw away the baby with the dirty water, but think about what works, how can we build on it. The other thing that I wanted to, a couple of issues that I think are really, really important is that I think when we talk about racial violence, I really think it's really important that you talk about racial capitalism. I think it's very, very important, because then people end up only talking about skin color or talking about a particular positionality, that if you are a Palestinian, for example, you could do nothing wrong. And we do know that there are, including the party that actually participated in the Israeli Knesset, that actually defines the problem is that quote unquote Palestinian on Palestinian violence, which is, I mean, it's, my God, I'm reading it and I'm thinking of Monahan and Glazer report of the ways in which actually the discussion when there is a Black Power movement, this is what they're talking about. So I think we actually can talk about all of these things. The other thing is that I think we really need to speak about things that are not spoken about. So there is a lot of the stuff that's actually not spoken about. A lot of the stuff that are difficult. People call it difficult conversations, dialogue, and Palestinians, we have a sensitivity to the word dialogue, because that always means liberal Zionists inviting us to come sit on and be using our bodies as a therapy couch so they can actually feel good by touching a Palestinian and so on. So, but actually having these discussions really and being very critical. And I think not actually just having consensus. I mean, it's okay to agree, disagree. It's okay to vote. We don't always have to consensus and kind of like beat ourselves at the end of the meeting until we all agree on everything. I mean, like there are certain models that are not really bad, from the movements that so. And I'm not talking about all the details, but I think it's really, really important for us to think about the materiality, to think about positionality, to think about politics, to think about what does it mean to have liberation, and even have a discussion. What does abolition mean? I mean, like in Palestine, where we were on the prisoner delegation, and everybody on the prisoner delegation was 100% for abolition. Okay, there are some Palestinian groups and some people in the US are also talking only about political prisoners. So what does this mean? And I know everybody knows this conversation, but this is something that we can talk about. The last point I would say is that sometimes it's very hard to have these conversations in public because everybody in the world, and actually especially people who dominate us, are watching and taking notes. So a lot of the time we act as if we're performing in public. And so there is also that content post about performative, but also about security and safety. And the fact that not what you say, whatever you want to say, you're going to get away with it. You can say whatever you say, but you get penalized depending on where you're at because of the institutions of surveillance and policing and repression that are going on in the world.
Wonderful. Yeah. Thank you so much for that, Rabab. And we did have one more question, and I think it's an important one to ask because it does touch on, I think, what you've been saying, Rabab, and points that have been raised earlier as well about the sort of material dimension of solidarity. I mean, there are two levels that people are speaking about here. One, kind of decolonizing solidarity, moving beyond sort of liberal understandings of solidarity and being led by the oppressed, which is crucial. And then the other side is the other part of that, and that sort of speaks to something also that Roxanne said earlier about people not really understanding what land back is, you know, the sort of referencing of land back, and also I think points you've made too, Rabab, about Palestinian solidarity, which is, you know, really taking solidarity, making, you know, thinking about solidarity as radical solidarity. And there is a material dimension to that, and that requires real risks, right? Taking risks. And I think what we've seen recently with workers shutting down the docks, the Zim boat, and you mentioned earlier, is an example of that in here in Oakland, in Elizabeth, New Jersey, South Africa, Italy. So this question asks from the participant is, where or what might be strategic places of intervention for movements? Thinking about block the boat, stopping the pipeline, but also Toussaint, going back to your discussion earlier about shut them down, like that's also another, you know, moving beyond the kind of platitudes about ending prison industrial complex to, you know, really being in solidarity with people who are on the inside, who are incarcerated, and really what does it mean to shut them down? So yeah, maybe if each person can sort of speak 1 to 2 minutes in the closing comments about that, that'd be great. Toussaint, would you like to, did you want to begin?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that's been noteworthy for me about that about this point is really just, yeah, the importance of tangible solidarity, material solidarity, as opposed to just sort of like gestures towards it or sort of like rhetorical expressions of solidarity. I think in my mind, in my lifetime, one of the sort of best examples, or one of the ways that I've been reminded of really the importance of that is working with student organizers at the University of Port-au-Prince. Like about a decade ago, they were holding a conference around neoliberalism in the university. And in the context of that conversation, working with student organizers who had been doing worker organizing that kicked off one of the sort of largest kind of wildcat strikes in kind of recent memory in Haiti. One of the things when we were saying, like, what kind of solidarity do you need? Part of their response was, we need you to take action where you are in the United States and really challenge the degree of really imperial power that dictate the sort of circumstances that Mireille was just speaking to, that are kind of circumscribing situations in Haiti right now. And I think for the shut them down demonstrations, one of the things that is really at the core of what's being called for is, in the past there's been, as you sort of suggested earlier, these sort of allusions to like, we need to get rid of the prison industrial complex and so on and so forth. And I think one of the things that is on the table at this moment in time is like, not only having the kind of demonstrations that were taking place, starting to happen during the pandemic, where folks were demonstrating outside of the facilities themselves, but really saying like, we need to really be in the practice of, if not like getting people out in the course of a pandemic, at the very least putting pressure, extreme pressure on the institutions to be able to remove folks from incredibly dangerous situations and circumstances that exist right now. And being able to, at the least, draw connections between the sort of investments that happen in our society in the perpetuation of the kind of prison slavery that exists right now, whether it's universities or other institutions of higher learning and whatnot. So it's really this question of moving beyond a sense of, hey, we need to be in conversation or we need to understand how our struggles are connected, to actually moving those struggles forward in a way that's that is tangible, and I think, as was mentioned earlier, involves like some degree of seriousness and some degree of, whether it's risk, whether it's a sense of how taking this action helps to move the ball forward. Just an indication that this is, not simply a measure that's taken as a way to kind of virtual signal how politically astute we are or what have you, but to actually be in the practice of moving us forward in terms of being able to have some degree of liberation.
Thank you for that.
I guess I'll go.
Great, Roxanne. Go ahead.
Okay, I'll go next because we want to finish, right? Well, I was thinking of the brilliance of the Black Lives Matter demonstrations last year, how it went. There's the spark of the George Floyd murder, but then the sparks went all over the place, and uprisings in unusual parts of the country, nooks and corners. In Oklahoma, where I come from, I could not believe. I know all the towns, and I couldn't believe there would be any kind of demonstration there against anything or for anything ever in my lifetime. And here they are, and also complaining about the military equipment that their small police forces were getting, and having, and of course, social media enhanced the connections, but then internationally, the uprisings. And I think what it taught me, or suggested to me, it was somewhat like Occupy Wall Street, in 2011 as well. And also like the Arab Spring, how we harness that, how we, I don't think we've done enough thinking about how that can, it is being followed up with, all kinds of things, including legislation, and with terrible right-wing backlash of actually criminalizing the teaching of what they call, what do they even call it? Critical race or something like that, that scholarly thing, but basically even talking about race in the classroom. And 28 states have passed these laws. So there is this backlash, but I think we should take that as a sign that it's effective, that we are being effective and not give up on it. But it is, I think we really have to take that very seriously, the success of these movements and then the dwindling afterwards. So as organizers or thinkers or strategists, I think we need to begin offering some ideas. And I have a few, but I think it has to be collective, you know, a collective endeavor. So that's what I really encourage, because the idea, like Standing Rock in 2016 was an amazing thing, but it was place-based. You had to go there. You had to go there in the snowstorm. And many people did, tens of thousands. It was just incredible. But that should have been spread, you know, it should have spread to other sites as well with the same issue. And there were all these other occupations going on, but occupying forests and, you know, where clear cutting is going on, not just pipelines, but to, you know, to present local organizers with some ideas of how they can jump in and not have to go there, you know, take off from their job or whatever to go there, but also start something that is a part of it.
Wonderful. Thank you for that, Roxanne. Rabab, would you like
Yeah, very quickly, I just want to probably build on what Roxanne and Toussaint have spoken, because I was when Standing Rock happened. I mean, some people went there, but it wasn't really necessary to kind of go. But I remember also when the movement began to fizzle down, and it was very cold, and people were struggling by themselves, and they were sued. There was sort of like lack of interest in general. And I think part of it, I mean, there's some people who would continue supporting and so on, but it's sort of, I think that's one of the challenges, to kind of think in this age of social media, of rapid kind of like things, a lot of the times you can be active on your online and so on. I'm not knocking it. I think it's really important to have social media and the cameras and showing what's going on and capturing, but I'm also thinking about what does this mean? So I don't want to rush and say this is not the good thing to do, but I want to think about when it's no longer in sight, what happens? When people are kind of like, now there is more and more responses around the whole institutionalization about Confederacy, statues and flags and so on and so forth. It happens, it responds to the movement. And then when the public space closes up, what happens? So that's one question. The other question I always ask, who has our backs? Who has our backs? Who has our backs always? Always, when it costs, when it doesn't cost, when it's popular, when it's not popular, who has our backs? And who are the people, and I know who are the people I'm going to go to when push comes to shove, no matter what, because I don't really have to explain a lot. They say, what do you need? What do you need, right? And then we can discuss later on what happened, what are the details, how do we dissect the movement and so on. So I think, and in that sense, it connects a lot to what Toussaint will talk about in terms of abolition and imagining a different future, imagining different ways of communicating with each other. The last thing I would say is that I think sometimes we only think about what happens in the US or in North America or something, although our conversation here has been quite international. I think it's really important to have these conversations. And when we say South-South, third worldism, global South, and so on, it's also understanding the South is in the North and the North is in the South. And there is a particular connection by people who think about the connections between materiality, capitalism, racism, settler colonialism, sexism, homophobia. How can we bring all of these things together and maintain? Sometimes actually, where do we do it? If there is no World Social Forum or the World Social Forum has changed to something else, how do we do all of these things? And so it's actually a real challenge, because we don't have those structures that we had before. We don't have the Banduns. We don't have OSPAL. We don't have and many of the structures there. And we're blocked physically by borders from going and seeing each other. We're blocked from being online. We're being surveyed and watched every single day and so on. So I think all of these questions require a lot. And I know that the movements have been doing this, so I'm not knocking it down. There are a lot of collaboration going on. But I'm just thinking about not only resistance, I'm talking about also liberation and what the liberated society, maybe also kind of like shout out to what Roxanne is talking about, the land. that what does it really actually, to have it materialize on the land? What does this mean? What does it mean for people to actually take things into their own hands and support them? And it's not the last word, because there is no last word. So.
Yes, thank you for that, Rabab. Yes, so thank you so much, really, to all of the speakers today. I know I have learned so much myself from your talks, and I have been profoundly inspired by each one of you, and the amazing work that you do. And I really appreciate the concrete examples that you've given us and ideas for what we can do moving forward. And to go back to a point that Roxanne made too, is that a reminder that this is collective work, this is collective action, and we need to continue to build and find those spaces. So thank you again to everyone for attending, all the participants, and for staying overtime. We really appreciate that, for the audience as well. And just a reminder that this is a kickoff for a Left Forum series that will continue creating this space for critical dialogue and learning across struggles and spaces related to the roots of the crisis in order to strengthen our movements and grow our solidarity.
Yeah, and just a final, again, echoing Karina's sentiments, I want to thank you to our amazing panelists, Toussaint, Roxanne, Mireille, Rabab, for offering your time and insights, and most so for the work you do here and beyond, kind of very much beyond our Zoom screens. And just dropping into the chat a few of the events that were mentioned that are coming up that hopefully folks will follow and follow up with and support. So there's the Shut 'em Down demonstrations, August 21st, September 9th, 2021, the upcoming 10-year anniversary of the Indigenous and Women of Color Feminist Delegation to Palestine. And then finally, the Free Palestine Queer Liberation March. So hopefully folks will follow up and also, as Karina says, continue to kind of engage and support and find critical space for dialogue here at the Left Forum. So thanks to everyone so much.
Thank everyone. Thanks.